This is a question I always like trying to answer. What is the dominant action video game genre of the current times? Competitive multiplayer FPS games share top-charting space with lengthy sandbox campaigns, but at the same time, just about everyone is dipping their finger into the free-to-play MOBA pie. And in retrospect, it seems like this diversity with the top-selling core action genres hasn't really been the norm. Go back just 5 years ago, and the dominant action game genre of modern military shooters was much easier to spot. Go back 15 to 20 years ago, and everyone was instead wanting a piece of the mascot platformer pie. After the successes of Spyro the Dragon, Insomniac eventually decided to scrap the franchise because the character wasn't versatile enough. According to an interview with Insomniac Games president Ted Price, Spyro didn't even have hands, he couldn't even hold a gun. So they followed themselves up in the most logical way possible by creating a mascot platformer all about holding guns. Ratchet and Clank is a series of shooty platformers that came out during a middling period where the dominance of mascot platformers was being traded out for the dominance of first-person shooters and genre-mixing sandbox games. And neither one of Ratchet's two mixed genres are super well developed, so much as they simply combine to form an elegant whole. It wasn't a clever, groundbreaking new idea. I mean, we're talking about a platforming game where the hero carries a sidekick around in their backpack, but it was instead just a sexy new makeover that smashed away the previous standards. Overloading our character with a bunch of creative gag guns that felt good to shoot turned the game into a versatile experience where players energetically blasted, rather than backtracked, through forward-moving levels. Levels that were still just about as big and diverse as the N64's best. And also factor in that it was a technological marvel for the time too, one of the best looking early PS2 games that also maintained a sturdy 60 FPS. So it was pretty good stuff. And so, Insomniac never really stopped. The franchise kept going and going well into the 2010s, giving Insomniac the support and clout to build original projects like Resistance and Sunset Overdrive along the way. The next most recent Ratchet game came out as recently as 2013. Although Ratchet has always been a highly rated and successful franchise, it was a little too late to strike the 3D platforming iron while it was still hot. Which may be why you don't see a lot of the same beloved brand recognition with these guys as you do for the platform heroes from just a generation earlier, or for the more relevant PS2 days, other more genre-defining hits like Devil May Cry and GTA 3. So although it's been 14 years since the original, the new Ratchet & Clank doesn't actually feel full of a whole lot of precious nostalgia, which makes it a bit of an unlikely candidate for Sony to be banking on nostalgia with now. A pseudo-remake game has been released alongside a reboot movie, and I consumed the both of them. The game's pretty darn good. You have mostly the same gameplay from earlier, almost untouched, except in ways that for the most part feel undoubtedly better. Mashing the fire button kinda auto-aims your shots where the camera is pointed like in the good old days, except now you can go into full shoulder shooter mode by holding the left trigger. Press the jump button while strafing and you pull off a bunch of action rolls with iframes that keep it from turning into a stop-and-pop cover shooter. Things like your speed and the camera's general behavior don't really change there, so seamlessly going from platforming controls to shooter controls is smooth as butter and one button away, whose behavior you can change with alternate options that give you room to pick which style you like the best. It is, after all, a platformer where you shoot, so staying vertically mobile and doing a lot of jumping while popping off good shots when you have Windows 2 is smooth as hell and just a super fun way to spend 10 hours. Variety was one of the big selling points of the original, and even after 14 years it's still refreshing to play a game that keeps throwing you into as many wacky situations as this one does. Clank gives us a small handful of puzzle breaks with radically different level design. Little vehicular minigames appear, but by being very short, they don't muddy up the whole game's focus, which is all squarely focused on challenging the player to smoothly shoot through vertical obstacle courses as destructively as possible. And the icing on the cake is that while gameplay is about as good as it's always been, so is the technological marvel of this thing. We might not have the high frame rate this time, but we do have a new standard set for the sheer amount of moving parts a game can cram on the screen, all the while maintaining some beautiful lighting and shading work. But what should really win the awards here is the animation work. A lot of detailed blotches of per-object motion blur covers up characters who grotesquely stretch for just a few frames, which, with both combined, is just enough to mask that lower frame rate, when you're not panning the camera at least. But more importantly, these frames of smear, as they're called, is a tried-and-true animation technique that makes motion appear more pronounced, but you don't often see it in 3D. The end result is a game that, in motion, appears more expressive and lively than pretty much anything I've ever seen before. But meanwhile, we have the script going along too.
They're making a game based on a holofilm based on my life? But they haven't even consulted me!
The whole narrative framework for this game is this clever meta joke, but give it about an hour and things start to wear thin. The game never overtly takes itself too seriously for what it is, which is great, but what's not as great is this apparent joke quota where we can't go for more than 10 minutes without the writers trying some kind of gag on something. So you have some jokes that work.
Many of you may be wondering, why are 300 heavily armed warbots marching ominously towards a Class G dread ship? The answer is simple, friends. Progress.
And a lot more that are just obnoxious.
I've done a lot of difficult things in my life, but by far the most difficult has been trying to say the word telepathopus 10 times fast. I believe it is impossible. Telepathopus, 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 see?
So despite as many leaps and bounds the remake climbed visually and mechanically, I feel like it's the non-interactive parts of its aesthetics that do take a step back from the original. And what helped me come to this conclusion were a couple hours spent playing the original and seeing the movie. For starters, the music in the original game is a hell of a lot more fun. It plays with diverse genres and infectious melodies, and the music in the remake is just kinda generic movie music. It's wannabe Danny Elfman, because it has to fit in with the very generic production score of a very generic film. More on that later. But first, I also noticed that the script of the original game also had a lot more punch to it too. Classically jarring early PS2 scene transitions show a team that might not really understand cinematic editing, but at least remembered the basics of buddy comedy. Ratchet and Clank are character foils. Their dialogue plays off one another because their straight guy comic guy conflict is more pronounced. They argue over just about everything, and their intense personalities gave the writing a lot of opportunities for the two to throw some playful punches. In the remake, though, Ratchet is a wide-eyed, typical teenager protagonist who gets along just swell with Clank seconds out of the gate, and Clank himself is just, well, he's just robotic. He's so devoid of personality that his levels are more like reminders of his existence than they are opportunities for his character to shine. The dialogue overall is just less dynamic. Though the remake does play better than the original, it doesn't really show itself better. So while the original games did have those personalities to them and what you could argue was a cinematic structure, something about the visual design of this IP's characters don't exactly look attractive. Which is why it always struck me as a strange decision to turn Ratchet and Clank into a movie. I get the logic behind it. These kid-friendly games are colorful and carefree, and Sony's movie licensing business is huge, and Sony Pictures Animation Studio sure knows how to play the branding game. But Sony didn't go the in-house route here. The Ratchet movie was made by a thick soup of a couple handfuls of production companies. You have resident Insomniac writer TJ Fixman collaborating with the brand new Blockade Entertainment and one of the very first spinners of CGI toy tie-ins, Rainmaker Entertainment, formerly Mainframe. They're the company that did Reboot. Add that to supporting celebrity characters voiced by the likes of John Goodman and Sylvester Stallone, and you have a movie that's just really bland. It's not a train wreck, but it is a paint-by-numbers, noisy kids flick where the majority of the humor comes from characters just saying something sarcastic. Whatever's unremarkable about Ratchet's writing bubbles up to the surface here, without a fun game to save it. But what's actually more interesting than the mediocrity of the movie is how it relates to the narrative of the game. Because after watching the movie, a whole lot of my issues with the game's narrative and characters suddenly made a lot of sense. All that confusion from before was now clear as day. The game's story is disjointed, characters end up behaving in ways contradictory to what's established, and the camera hangs on people and places that ultimately become irrelevant. And that's because the game's cutscenes actually turned out to be footage from the movie, which is kind of a slightly different story because it's 90 minutes long and the game's 10 hours long. They don't share the same continuity. Example, Clank gets thrown into an office to do some pencil pushing with the Intel support girl, while Ratchet's separated away to do some combat training instead. But in the game, the next level loads in and we're doing combat training and Clank's right there in our backpack, as he is in every level. But later on in the game, you get a cutscene where you hear him talk about doing a lot of research on the bad guys while cooped up in that office, because in the movie, he never left that office. Most of the game's content happens in places never even mentioned in the film. They're really good levels, but they do have a lower bar of dialogue and story content compared to the others, and you'd never know why unless you saw the movie and saw the influence it has over the pacing of the game. Plus, a lot of character development ends up happening off-screen, because if more movie footage was on-screen, I guess they think it'd hurt ticket sales? It makes the whole movie not just look unnecessary, but also kinda destructive. A remake of Ratchet and Clank with modern controls and graphics was a noble enough endeavor. It didn't need a movie to go along with it, and splitting resources between the two might have actually hurt it. After all, Ratchet and Clank doesn't really need top-quality writing and acting when the core combat is just this fun. Because as it stands, my biggest issue with the game are the parts it shares with the movie. It's a lack of personality and humor that deflates the enthusiasm of what would otherwise be a straight improvement on the original. I mean, besides there are some slight mechanical issues, your melee combo animation just kinda sends you clipping right into an enemy's hitbox. A few lethal drops look like they should be totally safe, and there's some weird logic going on where the game decides to silently change what's in your quick switch weapon slot. I eventually learned when it does this and adapted, but I'd rather it just didn't do that. But those are minor complaints. I wish I could have just spent the review saying the game's great except for like 3 super nerdy nitpicks, but it was really the movie that clued me into a greater influence siphoning away some of this fun. The Ratchet and Clank film is being marketed under a new label of PlayStation Originals, with another one based on Sly Cooper coming out from the same company. There's also a little Easter egg reference to Jak and Daxter in the movie, though there's nothing official on that one yet. If Sony does manage to find developers and funding for more PS2 platformer remakes, I hope I can spend those reviews saying the games are great except for like 2 or 3 super nerdy nitpicks. As it stands, though, this one's actually pretty good. It's just $40, you got about 10 good hours out of it. Everything's alright, the world's gonna be okay. Just don't get excited about the movie existing.
I'm starting to get real tired of these vlogs. You know they showed up just as I was about to speak on a panel about everything wrong with comic book-based holo films. All the great bloggers were on it. Me, Stuart Zergo, Obsidia Van Schmoot.
Van Schmoot was there? Really? Oh, I love her. She hates everything.
There isn't a holo film, game, or online product launch she hasn't shredded in the comment section. You know, that kind of judgment takes real skill.